Welcome to Tom's True Crime. Today we take you to Berlin, Ohio. Also, I'd love to know, where are you from? October 18th, 2014, Gary Matberg, a farmer, was out checking on his livestock near the barn when he noticed something unusual. The barn door was slightly ajar, swinging in the breeze. Curious, Gary stepped inside and immediately recoiled at the sight before him. Debra Granwicz's body lay on the cold, damp floor, her face pale and her eyes lifeless. Blood had dried in a dark pool around her head, and the pitchfork rested nearby, still stained with her blood. The scene was horrific, a stark contrast to the quiet simplicity of the barn. Gary, shaken to his core, ran back to his truck and called the police. In the 2014, Berlin was a quaint Ohio town, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. Life revolved around Sunday church services, potluck dinners, and porch-side conversations. At the center of it all was Pastor Alan Walkhaus, a man who carried the weight of his congregation on his shoulders. His sermons brought people to tears, and his presence brought them comfort. But behind the pulpit, Alan was a man drowning in his own loneliness. Alan's marriage to Marlene Walkhaus was far from perfect. Marlene came from a wealthy, influential family in Berlin. Her father owned half the town's businesses, and her mother was the social queen of every church luncheon. Marlene took after them, focusing more on status than substance. She loved throwing lavish events and ensuring the Walkhaus name stayed on everyone's lips. But when it came to Alan, her love was transactional. Behind the polished smile and expensive pearls, Marlene was cold and distant. For years, Alan tried to bridge the emotional gap in their marriage, but Marlene wasn't interested. She had what she wanted, a picture-perfect image of a preacher's wife. As long as Alan played his role, she was satisfied. But inside, Alan was crumbling. He longed for companionship, someone to see him as more than just Pastor Walkhaus. Then came Debra Granwicz, a woman battling her own demons. Debra had married Paul Granwicz, a stoic and emotionally detached man, out of necessity rather than love. Paul was a mechanic who spent more time at his garage than at home. Their marriage was like an empty house, functional but void of warmth. Debra, only 34, felt as if her life had passed her by. She had no children, no spark, and no purpose. At church fundraiser in late March 2014, Debra caught Alan's eye. She wore a simple but flattering dress, her laughter carrying across the room as she spoke to the other women. But beneath her charm was a deep sadness, something Alan recognized because he felt it too. That evening, Debra approached Alan with a plate of homemade cornbread and a smile that lingered a second too long. Their conversation began innocently about the church's new roof fund, but soon drifted into more personal territory. Debra confided that she often felt out of place in Berlin, like she didn't belong. Alan listened, his eyes softening. He felt seen, something Marlene hadn't given him in years. Over the following weeks, their interactions became more frequent. It started with shared smiles during the Bible study on Wednesday evenings. Debra began staying behind after church events, finding reasons to help Alan clean up or organize hymnals. Each encounter felt charged, a tension building between them. By the mid-May 2014, their stolen glances turned into something more. They arranged to meet privately, first at Debra's home when Paul was working late, then at a secluded motel on the outskirts of town. These moments were intoxicating for both of them. Debra found in Alan the emotional connection she had craved for years. Alan, in turn, felt alive for the first time in what seemed like forever. Their affair quickly became an all-consuming passion. Debra became reckless, leaving traces of her perfume on Alan's shirt and lipstick smudges on his collar. Alan tried to maintain control, praying for strength every night, but his resolve faltered whenever he saw Debra. By September 2014, Debra started feeling unwell, frequent nausea, fatigue, and a sense of heaviness she couldn't ignore. A visit to the local clinic confirmed what she already suspected. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with excitement. She told Alan during one of their secret meetings at the motel. His reaction was immediate. Panic washed over his face. For Debra, the pregnancy was a beacon of hope, a chance to start a new life away from the suffocating constraints of Berlin. She envisioned running away with Alan, raising their child together, far from the prying eyes of the town. But for Alan, it was a crisis. He was already racked with guilt over the affair, and the thought of a child threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. He couldn't bring himself to leave his congregation, and he certainly couldn't face Marlene. Debra tried to convince him. She spoke of the life they could build together, free from judgment and pretense. Alan listened, but hesitated. He told her he needed time to think, though in truth he was paralyzed by fear. By 9 a.m., the barn was swarming with investigators. Detective Kate Miller, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, arrived at the scene. She surveyed the area with a practiced eye, noting the brutality of the attack. The blow to Debra's head was precise, but vicious, and the lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been caught off guard. The investigators worked methodically, collecting evidence and documenting every detail. They collected the pitchfork and photographed the blood patterns around Debra's body. Detective Miller couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a random act of violence. The personal nature of the attack suggested a deeper motive, one rooted in anger and betrayal. By October 20, 2014, the police had begun questioning those closest to Debra. Her husband, Paul Granwicz, was the first person they brought in. Paul's reaction to his wife's death was puzzling. He seemed detached, almost indifferent, as if he had already mourned the loss of their relationship long ago. He admitted that their marriage had been strained for years, and that he was aware of Debra's infidelity, but claimed he didn't care enough to act on it. Detective Miller found his demeanor unsettling, but ultimately believed his lack of emotion stemmed from resignation rather than guilt. With little evidence tying him to the crime, the investigators began exploring other angles. On October 24, 2014, a breakthrough came when a search of Debra's belongings revealed a hidden stash of love letters exchanged between her and Pastor Alan. The letters were explicit, detailing their affair and Debra's hopes for a future together. Detective Miller immediately brought Alan in for questioning. Racked with guilt, Alan confessed to the affair, but vehemently denied any involvement in Debra's death. He described his struggles with his faith, his crumbling marriage, and his guilt over betraying his congregation. The revelation sent shockwaves through Berlin. The town's beloved pastor was now at the center of a scandal that threatened to tear the community apart. As the investigation progressed, Detective Miller began to focus on Marlene. Witnesses had reported her increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks leading up to Debra's death. Marlene's public persona remained composed, but those close to her noticed cracks in her facade. Unbeknownst to both Alan and Debra, Marlene had been growing suspicious. She noticed Alan's late nights and the way he seemed distracted during their conversations. Marlene was not a woman to be crossed. Her marriage to Alan was a cornerstone of her image, and she couldn't afford a scandal. Marlene began watching Alan more closely. In early October 2014, she followed him one evening after Bible study, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. What she saw confirmed her worst fears, Alan entering the motel where Debra was waiting. Her discovery left her seething. To Marlene, this wasn't just infidelity, it was a threat to her entire identity. If the affair became public, her name would be dragged through the mud, and her family's reputation would be destroyed. For weeks, she stood in silence, plotting her next move. Then one afternoon, while organizing donations at the church, Marlene overheard Debra talking to a friend about her pregnancy. Though Debra didn't name the father, Marlene knew. The revelation was the breaking point. Debra wasn't just having an affair with her husband, she was carrying his child. Marlene's fury transformed into cold calculation. She wasn't just going to confront Debra, she was going to ensure that this woman and her unborn child could never threaten her life again. It was a cold and stormy night in mid-October 2014 when Marlene Walkhaus decided to take matters into her own hands. Rain lashed against the windows of her stately home as she sat in her living room, staring at the flickering flames of the fireplace. The storm mirrored her internal chaos, a swirl of rage and despair that had grown unbearable since discovering her husband's betrayal. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, the affair, the pregnancy, and the audacity of Debra Granwicz to endanger everything Marlene had built. For Marlene, the thought of losing control over her carefully curated life was unbearable. The scandal would ruin her reputation, her standing in the community, and the Walkhaus family name. It wasn't just about jealousy, it was about survival. Her marriage to Pastor Alan had been her armor, her way of maintaining relevance and power. In a town where image was everything, now Debra threatened to tear it all apart. Marlene spent days planning her next move. She knew confronting Alan wouldn't solve anything. He was weak, too easily swayed by his emotions. Debra, however, was a different story. To Marlene, Debra represented everything that was wrong with the world: reckless, selfish, and destructive. The fact that she carried Alan's child was the ultimate insult, a reminder that Debra had succeeded where Marlene had failed. The turning point came when a search warrant was executed at the Walkhaus estate on November 1, 2014. Among Marlene's belongings, investigators found a blood-stained scarf tucked away in the back of her closet. The scarf's fibers matched those found at the crime scene, and forensic testing confirmed it was stained with Debra's blood. The evidence was damning. Combined with Marlene's motive and erratic behavior, it painted a clear picture of her involvement in the murder. On the morning of November 15, 2014, police arrived at the Walkhaus residence to arrest Marlene. She was hosting a brunch for the church's women's group, a final attempt to maintain her perfect image. As officers led her away in handcuffs, the room fell silent. The women, who had once admired Marlene's poise and elegance, now stared at her in disbelief. Marlene maintained her composure, though her eyes betrayed the panic she felt. The community of Berlin was stunned. Their perfect preacher's wife was now the prime suspect in a murder case, and the life they thought they knew was crumbling before their eyes. The arrest marked the beginning of a long journey toward justice for Debra, leaving Berlin to grapple with the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. The trial of Marlene Walkhaus began in March 2015 at the county courthouse in Berlin, a town that had never seen a scandal of this magnitude. Word of the case had spread far beyond the town's borders, drawing reporters, curious onlookers, and even legal enthusiasts from neighboring counties. The courtroom was packed every day with rows filled by community members, many of whom had once admired Marlene. The air was thick with tension and morbid curiosity. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Mira Johnson, set the tone from the start. Johnson was a skilled and relentless attorney who understood the importance of the case. She painted Marlene as a cold, calculating woman who was willing to commit murder to protect her reputation. Using the evidence gathered from the Walkhaus home, the blood-stained scarf, witness testimonies, and Marlene's erratic behavior, Johnson wove a narrative of control, jealousy, and premeditation. On the evening of October 17, 2014, Marlene reached out to Debra under the guise of a private conversation. She framed it as an attempt to make peace, appealing to Debra's vulnerability. Debra, perhaps naively, agreed. Marlene chose the meeting spot carefully, an old barn on the outskirts of Berlin, where she knew they wouldn't be disturbed. As the rain poured down, Marlene arrived at the barn. She waited for Debra to arrive, her thoughts racing. When she saw the woman step out of her car, drenched but determined, Marlene felt a surge of hatred she could barely contain. Inside the barn, the confrontation began. Marlene wasted no time accusing Debra of destroying her marriage and ruining her life. Debra didn't back down. She admitted to the affair, even revealing the pregnancy, hoping to force Marlene to face the truth. But instead of defusing the situation, the confession acted as a trigger. Marlene snapped. Her vision blurred with anger as the two women argued. Debra, still believing there was some humanity in Marlene, tried to reason with her. But Marlene wasn't listening. She saw only a threat that needed to be eliminated. The argument escalated into a physical struggle, with Debra trying to defend herself against Marlene's growing rage. Marlene grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the wall. In the heat of the moment, she swung it with all her strength, striking Debra on the side of her head. The force of the blow sent Debra crashing to the ground, blood pooling beneath her. Marlene froze for a moment, staring at what she had done. Then, in a panic, she dropped the pitchfork and fled the barn, leaving Debra's lifeless body behind. The prosecutor reminded the jury that Marlene had not acted out of passion, but out of a desire to eliminate a threat to her carefully constructed life. The defense, led by Aaron Williams, a well-known and experienced lawyer, had a difficult case to argue. Williams chose to frame Marlene's actions as a momentary lapse in judgment, spurred by her husband's betrayal and the humiliation of Debra's pregnancy. He argued that Marlene's reaction was one of rage, not premeditation, and urged the jury to consider the emotional toll she had endured in the months leading up to the murder. As the trial unfolded, the emotional toll on everyone involved became clear. Pastor Alan Walkhaus, once the town's moral compass, became the trial's most compelling witness. His testimony was a study in guilt and vulnerability. He admitted to his affair with Debra, describing how their relationship had grown from shared loneliness into something he deeply regretted. Alan's words about Marlene revealed a woman obsessed with appearances, someone who cared more about maintaining her public image than nurturing their marriage. He spoke of her coldness and how it had pushed him into a place of despair. Yet, even as he shared these painful truths, Alan expressed sorrow for how his choices had contributed to the tragedy. His voice trembled as he described how the weight of his guilt had driven him to resign from the church. The courtroom was silent during Alan's testimony, the only sounds coming from Marlene's sharp breaths. She sat at the defense table, her face stoic, but her eyes betraying flashes of emotion, anger, perhaps, or shame. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, refusing to show remorse for what had happened. To some, her cold demeanor reinforced the prosecution's argument that she was capable of murder. Other witnesses, including neighbors and members of the church, testified to Marlene's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. They described her as increasingly erratic, a stark contrast to the polished and composed woman they thought they knew. Some recalled overhearing her complain about Debra, her words laced with disdain and fury. One of the most striking moments of the trial came when the prosecution displayed photographs from the crime scene. The gruesome images of Debra's lifeless body and the blood-stained pitchfork were confronting images of the violence that had occurred. Many in the courtroom turned away, unable to look, but Marlene stared straight ahead, unflinching. The trial lasted for nearly 3 weeks, with every detail dissected and debated. By the time the jury began deliberations on March 18, 2015, the community of Berlin was deeply divided. Some believed Marlene was a victim of her circumstances, while others saw her as a ruthless woman who would stop at nothing to protect her social standing. On March 20, 2015, the jury returned their verdict. After 2 days of deliberation, they found Marlene Walkhaus guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted with emotion. Debra's few remaining family members wept quietly in the back row. Pastor Alan lowered his head, relief and sorrow etched on his face. Marlene remained expressionless, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as the sentence was read: life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the town of Berlin, the trial's conclusion marked the end of a long and painful chapter, but the repercussions of Marlene's actions and those of everyone involved would ripple through the community for years to come. The fallout from the trial was immediate and far-reaching. Pastor Alan Walkhaus, unable to reconcile his faith with his sins, resigned from his position at the church. On April 5, 2015, he delivered his final sermon to a somber congregation. Many in the church were torn between their anger at his betrayal and their sympathy for his obvious remorse. Afterward, Alan packed his belongings and left Berlin, retreating to a small town where he could try to rebuild his life in anonymity. Paul Granwicz, Debra's estranged husband, quietly sold their home and moved away from Berlin in May 2015. He didn't attend the trial or make any public statements about Debra's death, leaving many to wonder how deeply he had truly cared for her. Some whisper that he was relieved to be free from the marriage, while others saw his departure as a sign of grief too heavy to bear. For Abby Walkhaus, Marlene and Alan's teenage daughter, the events were devastating. At just 14 years old, Abby was forced to grapple with the reality of her mother's crime and her father's affair. In June 2015, she moved in with extended family in Columbus, leaving behind the only home she had ever known. Abby's departure was the final blow to the Walkhaus family, a once respected household now fractured beyond repair. Berlin, a town once defined by its close-knit community and southern charm, became a place haunted by scandal and loss. The church struggled to regain its footing, attendance dwindling as members grappled with the betrayal of their trusted pastor. The story of Marlene's trial and Alan's affair became a cautionary tale whispered about in homes and diners for years to come. The town had learned a painful lesson. Even in places where appearances are carefully maintained, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface, and when that darkness is unleashed, the consequences can be devastating. What drives passion and faith can turn into betrayal and tragedy. This tale of Berlin reminds us that behind closed doors, even the most righteous can succumb to the darkest sins. In the small Ohio town of Berlin, where church was the heartbeat of the community, a scandal of biblical proportions unraveled. A preacher's forbidden affair with a lonely wife spiraled into jealousy, betrayal, and murder, shaking the town to its core. This is the story of love gone wrong, a life lost, and justice served in a tale that left Berlin forever changed. This case is a very sad one that reminds us of the dangers friends and family can bring to us. Thank you for being with us on this episode of Tom's True Crime. If you are interested in more in-depth investigations into the most perplexing crimes, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. What are your thoughts about this case? Please share them with us in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe.